Long before Bernie Madoff took their money, Kevin Bacon and Kyra Sedgwick had already learned how to survive hard years together, and that marriage is exactly why 2008 didn't break them. But when Bacon talks about what actually steadied him that year, he doesn't stop at his wife. He goes further, back to a quiet film role nobody was paying attention to, a scene on a bench beside a stranger's daughter that he said, more than once, saved the entire performance, and maybe more than just the performance. What happened on that bench? Kevin Norwood Bacon was born on the 8th of July 1958 in Philadelphia, the youngest of 6 children in a family where community mattered as much as ambition. His father, Edmund Bacon, was one of the city's most influential urban planners, a man whose entire career centered on how people connect to the places they live and to each other. That instinct for connection ended up defining his son's entire acting career too, long before Kevin understood it that way himself, showing up decades later in the quietest, least flashy role he ever accepted. His first film role came almost by accident. Still, a teenage acting student in New York without an agent, Bacon got noticed when a casting director asked his school for any students who looked, in the words used at the time, wet behind the ears. He was sent to meet director John Landis for National Lampoon's Animal House, and during the audition, someone described the character as smarmy, a word Bacon didn't actually know the meaning of. He improvised a face he guessed might look smarmy anyway. Landis loved it instantly. Bacon quit his waiter job, spent 5 weeks on what he's called a magical experience, and came home to New York convinced, in his words, "That's it, baby. I am set. I'm a movie star." Then he didn't work for months. He had to beg for his old restaurant job back, and when the film finally premiered in Times Square, he had to ask for the night off just to attend, only to discover most of the cast had flown in from California and were walking a red carpet he wasn't part of. He's called it a super humbling kind of night. Funny only in retrospect. 2 years later, Bacon landed the role horror fans still bring up in every single interview he does. In Friday the 13th, he played Jack, whose death became one of cinema's most iconic slasher kills after breaking the genre's oldest unwritten rule. He said the #1 photograph fans shove in front of him to sign, to this day, is that exact image, himself dead and covered in blood, a detail he still finds a little strange to sit with decades later. The role that actually built his craft came in 1982 with Barry Levinson's Diner. Bacon read for 2 different parts, drawn first to Boogie, the cool, tough one, and then to Billy, the romantic one, before Levinson sent him out to simply watch fellow cast member Fenwick instead. Disappointed at first, since Fenwick barely had any lines, Bacon got called back for a second reading while running a 104-degree fever, sick enough that he could barely function. That illness, it turned out, gave the character exactly the low-level drunken haze Levinson had been looking for the whole time. "I sort of lucked out with the flu on that one," Bacon has said. Diner became one of the defining experiences of his acting life, and Levinson would go on to become one of the only directors to hire him twice, a partnership that would matter enormously years later. 2 years after that came Footloose, the film that turned him into something closer to a pop idol than an actor. Bacon has said it was one of those life-changing kind of things, going overnight from an actor some people recognize to a genuine pop culture star, even though, ironically, stardom of that specific kind was the last thing he wanted by that point in his career. Having taken theater and craft so seriously by then that he's admitted, looking back, he could have embraced the pop stardom of it all a little more gracefully than he did at the time. Shooting in a small Mormon community in Utah, he initially assumed the dance sequences would be loosely improvised, telling the director, "I see that there's these dance things in here. You could get a choreographer if you want to, but I like to dance. Why don't you just turn on the camera and I'll just dance around?" He had no idea how tightly choreographed it would actually become, ending up with a dance double, 2 separate gymnastics doubles for different stunts, and a stunt double on top of that, joking that after a while he started to wonder, "Why am I even here? Is somebody gonna come in and double me on the acting?" What fans have pointed out ever since is that neither Bacon nor most of his castmates, aside from a young Sarah Jessica Parker, were trained dancers at all, which is precisely why the film still feels so alive decades later, rough edges and all, compared to the more polished, professionally cast 2011 remake. By 1990, the pressure of building a real, sustainable career caught up with him hard. While filming the low-budget monster movie Tremors, Bacon's wife was pregnant with their first child. His mother was seriously ill, and money had run dry. I remember just kind of talking to my wife, and we were having a conversation, almost like just kind of breaking down on about 89th and Broadway, he's recalled, saying to her, "Can't believe I'm doing a movie about underground worms." Tremors became one of the earliest films to explode on home video. Back in what he's jokingly called the era of "these things you kids don't know about," they're called videotapes. And Bacon has since called it the one role he'd genuinely want to revisit, proud of it despite how frightened and financially stretched he was while making it. Fans still consider it one of the most purely satisfying creature features ever made, and he's called it, without hesitation, one of the few characters he's ever played that he'd love to step back into. He turned down Tremors 2 outright, reasoning bluntly, "Tremors 1 was a bomb. I don't want to do a part 2 of a movie that didn't do well the first time around. They made 8 more anyway, without him." That same decade brought A Few Good Men in 1992, a role Bacon almost didn't take. He said he's naturally drawn to darker, more complicated characters, worried that playing anyone too straightforwardly decent would be boring to watch. "I'm often drawn to the darker kind of characters, and I'm afraid sometimes that if somebody's just stand-up and follows the straight and narrow, it's just not going to be interesting," he's admitted. It was his wife who insisted he take the part of the prosecuting officer anyway, telling him plainly, "You gotta play this guy. He's a good guy. He's a stand-up guy." And she turned out to be exactly right. Sharing scenes with Jack Nicholson, an actor Bacon has called a genuine hero of his growing up, taught him something he's carried ever since. Watching a lead actor who clearly didn't care whether the audience liked him or not, and still commanded every scene anyway. He's described the production itself almost like theater, rehearsed for weeks on a taped-out soundstage before filming ever began, calling director Rob Reiner's preparation so thorough that shooting days never ran long, with real lunches and weekends spent together as a cast rather than the usual grinding blockbuster schedule. 4 years later, Sleepers gave Bacon the role fans still call one of the most disturbing performances of his career. A sadistic reformed school guard named Sean Noakes, a character so vile that comment sections decades later still describe him as one of the most repulsive villains ever put on screen. Bacon has said he doesn't fear playing dark material, describing it almost as therapy. "Part of being an actor is being able to tap into our darker side," he's explained. "I think all of us as human beings have pain, anxiety, fear, extreme thoughts, and desires, but we just don't act on them generally. Going to those dark places is sort of therapeutic in a way, because it's an outlet as opposed to just pressing it down." He's spoken about the shoot's physical demands too, taking 7 squibs, small explosive blood charges, in a single violent scene, more than he'd ever worn before, leaving real, non-life-threatening burns on his chest, despite the protective vest underneath. When asked directly whether he's ever hesitant to take a role because of how audiences might judge him for it, his answer has stayed consistent for decades. "I'm not afraid of playing anything. I really am not. If I think it's good and interesting and I haven't done it before, I'll do it." Bacon's willingness to disappear into difficult, unglamorous material kept expanding through the 2000s and 2010s. In 2011's X-Men First Class, he played the villain Sebastian Shaw, a role that required him to learn entire scenes of dialogue in German. And then, once director Matthew Vaughn saw how well that went, an additional scene in Russian on top of it, joking afterward that the German alone had already been hard enough. He's called the film's research process genuinely fun, diving into decades of comic book history handed to him by devoted fans on the crew, even while acknowledging that studio blockbusters move at a painstaking pace compared to smaller films, with far more voices weighing in on every decision. Then, in 2008, everything outside the film industry collapsed at once. Bacon and Sedgwick discovered a significant portion of their savings had vanished into Bernie Madoff's fraud, one of the largest financial scandals in American history, right as Bacon was quietly shooting a small HBO television film called Taking Chance. Speaking about how the marriage survived that period, Bacon has credited an old habit built over decades together. "We've been married for a really long time, and in our relationship I made all the money. and then she got on. The closer and I wasn't making jack, and for 7 years she made all the money, he's explained. So we already had this kind of balance about that whole issue. That history meant the Madoff collapse didn't become a source of conflict between them. We knew we could, we'd be all right. We knew we were going to have each other and that our kids were okay, he said. There were so many people that got hit so much harder than us. I don't think there was a moment where that thing happened and then we got pissed at each other. It was sort of the opposite. He's described their reaction less as panic and more as a shared, almost stubborn calm. The two of them quietly agreeing they'd keep the apartment, keep their footing, and simply work their way back. But the role he was shooting during that exact same stretch is the one Bacon has since credited with something closer to actual healing. In Taking Chance, based on a true story, Bacon played Lieutenant Colonel Michael Strobel, a Marine officer who volunteers to personally escort the body of a young fallen Lance Corporal named Chance Phelps home to his family in Wyoming, a solemn, near-wordless journey through airports and small towns where ordinary strangers quietly stop what they're doing to honor a soldier they never knew. Bacon has said he took the role specifically because of a single scene, sitting on a bench beside a young girl. I took the part kind of because of the scene where I'm sitting on the bench with the little girl, he's explained. Because I thought to myself, if I can make this moment work, then I can back the whole movie up from there. I thought it was so well written and so chilling a moment. He's talked about resisting the instinct most actors have to worry whether a role makes them look good or likable, drawing a clear line between two different kinds of performer. That's the difference between an actor and a movie star or a celebrity, he said. The willingness to disappear into something quiet and uncomfortable instead of chasing a flattering close-up. The role demanded a level of restraint almost nothing else in his filmography had asked of him, built entirely on posture, silence, and the specific formal rituals of military honor rather than a single big monologue. Audiences and critics responded to that restraint immediately, and veterans and military families in particular reached out in numbers Bacon has said genuinely moved him, telling him the film had gotten the small, exact details of grief and ceremony right in ways almost nothing else in Hollywood ever had. Taking Chance earned Bacon a Golden Globe and a Screen Actors Guild Award for his performance, arguably the two most significant acting honors of his entire career up to that point, more than 2 decades after Footloose had first made him famous, and a sharp break from the darker, more morally compromised characters like Noakes that audiences had spent years associating him with most. It's easy to see, looking back, why that specific role landed the way it did at that specific moment in his life. While Bacon's own financial world was quietly falling apart off camera, he spent his working hours each day inhabiting a man whose entire job was carrying other people's grief with total dignity, refusing to let personal discomfort interrupt the responsibility of showing up completely for someone else. He wasn't escorting caskets. He was navigating a much smaller, much more private kind of loss with Kyra. Off camera, one apartment, and one hard financial conversation at a time. But something about spending months embodying a character defined entirely by steadiness under enormous pressure appears to have given Bacon exactly the frame he needed to process his own year, a quiet, ritualized model for getting through catastrophe without losing yourself in it. He's never framed it quite that dramatically himself, but the timeline speaks for itself. And so does the fact that this small, spare television film about honoring the dead remains one of the performances he speaks about with the most visible emotion, decades and dozens of roles later. Strobel wasn't Bacon's only brush with military and command roles either. In 1991's JFK, he played a small but memorably unsettling part as a former Marine-turned-hustler tangled up in Oliver Stone's sprawling conspiracy epic. And in 2016's Patriots Day, he played FBI agent Richard Deslauriers, leading the real manhunt after the Boston Marathon bombing, bringing the same calm, disciplined command presence that Taking Chance had first asked of him years earlier. A through line fans have started to notice runs straight through nearly every authority figure he's played since. Calm men holding enormous weight without ever needing to raise their voice to prove it. Bacon has continued chasing exactly the kind of variety that's defined his entire career ever since. From playing a green-suited Invisible Man in Hollow Man, a role he assumed would be an easy paycheck, until he discovered the physical misery of latex glued to his mouth for months at a time, to a corrupt FBI agent on Showtime's City on a Hill, to sharing white-knuckle river rapids with John C. Reilly and Charlize Theron on the River Wild. He's spoken with real warmth about working alongside Clint Eastwood on Mystic River, describing Eastwood's famously fast, unrehearsed shooting style and calling the entire experience, dark subject matter included, one of the most purely enjoyable of his career. And decades after Footloose first made him a reluctant teen idol, he still approaches every new role the same way he approached Michael Strobel, guided by that same simple, often repeated philosophy about never being afraid of where a good, interesting part might take him. That's really the through line, connecting a smarmy fraternity pledge, a doomed camp counselor, a feverish diner regular, a reluctant pop idol, a sadistic prison guard, a Cold War villain fluent in German and Russian, and a grieving Marine escorting a stranger's son home. Kevin Bacon has spent nearly 5 decades refusing to specialize in comfort, chasing whatever role scared him most rather than whatever role flattered him most. And when his own life needed steadying, right in the middle of losing a fortune he and his wife had spent decades building together, it wasn't a friend, a financial planner, or a single well-timed phone call that pulled him through. It was a quiet, uncelebrated role about showing up completely for someone else's worst day, with no reward attached except the simple fact of having done it right. If this look behind the life of Kevin Bacon moved you, give this video a like and subscribe to the channel. There are so many more roles worth revisiting than a highlight reel could ever cover, and we'll keep pulling back the curtain on the real stories behind the actors you grew up watching, because the truths behind their careers deserve to be remembered too.